Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So while we set up, I'll take this opportunity to introduce the panel. Unfortunately, Professor Bani Pityana, who was on the program, was unable to join us today, but we've got to still have a fantastic panel with Professor Tawana Kupe, who is the vice-chancellor and principal of the University of Pretoria, as from this year. And prior to that, he was the vice principal of the University of the Witwatersrand, down the road, and our neighbors and competitors, yes. And also held a number of portfolios within the University of Witwatersrand, but never students, Prof. Kupe. That's the only thing that's missing. You were never in charge of student affairs. Excuse me? You were at some point. So the entire leadership portfolio within the university. And Dr. Nico Jooste is the director of the Africa Center for Higher Education, Internationalization. He was also the founding director for the Office of Internationalization, International Education at the Nelson Mandela University in the Eastern Cape. He was also the president of the International Education Association of South Africa, AISA. He does research on higher education, internationalization in developing and emerging world. He is also continuing his research in the history of South Africa with a specific focus on the Eastern Cape frontier. I'm from the Eastern Cape. A new focus of his research is, as a historian, is on maritime history with specific focus on the influence of mercantile fleets circling southern Africa. So this part of the program moves back to people and what universities are doing to get our graduates ready to tackle these challenges and also solutions of the future. And I think Stafford pointed out that, the model's going to change completely. And, and we always have to be thinking about how we're going to meet that challenge or overcome it and have a leapfrog before. So what we're going to do is start by having each speaker share their insights, their experience, and what their institutions are doing, and from different perspectives. It can either be from the whole approach of diversity or internationalization and decolonisation. I think in South Africa, after the recent student uprisings or protests, decolonisation was on the agenda and part of the discussions. And a lot of people think it has disappeared, but no, it hasn't. It has become part of our business as usual these days. So I will hand over to Professor Kupe to kick things off. Thanks.
How many minutes?
I will flag you when we at that time. Yeah, but 20. Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting and very broad topic. So what I think best way to do this, one can't speak about everything, is to use the lens of Can you hear me now? Yeah. So I think it's a broad and very rich topic, and one can't cover everything in 20 minutes. But what I will do is try and use the lens of internationalization of universities as a way of entering the topic. I can say that I wouldn't be sitting here today, or I wouldn't be a vice-chancellor today, if at a particular stage in my education, I didn't get one of my qualifications, namely the PhD, in a project of internationalization by 2 universities in 2 continents. That was a university in Africa and a university in Scandinavia, where I got my PhD. If he looks at his databases, you will notice that the University of Oslo was nowhere in the international rankings until he started embarking on an internationalization strategy. After that strategy, it is hovered even in the top 100. And this is what the internationalization strategy consisted of, and will also frame my discussion of this topic. So just upfront before I lose time, is I think there are 5 interesting, interrelated elements. It's the curriculum, research strategy or agendas, the presence of people, mobilities and exchanges, networks and networking. And those things have to be put into a framework of partnerships and collaborations. And so if I run out of time, you can then ask me questions on those things that I left out. So back to my example. So what the University of Oslo was a university that tended to teach and even publish in Norwegian, which is spoken by just 5 million people. So their research wasn't reaching the impact that they had. So you can attack me for contradicting myself earlier on. English actually took them better into the rankings. That's one of the points I was making. But they needed to do that. But they also did something else. They considered actually to have an internationalization strategy. What that simply meant is that whosoever wanted among the staff, the faculty and departments had international partners or colleagues. They wrote articles together, they visited each other, they might go to conferences together, and so on, but it was basically individually based. And those students who wanted to apply to the University of Oslo came on their own and they were considered international students and reported to someone who said, I look after international students. But those students then had to learn Norwegian for a year before they could embark on any academic program. That meant it took them a long time to complete their degrees. And many of them soon drifted into informal employment. And it took 10 years to do a PhD, 5 years to do a master's, or never completed, or moved on to another European country. So the throughput levels or the graduation rates were very low. Once the internationalization strategy started on, which is what we are using at the University of Pretoria, they said, okay, people will always come on their own. People will always collaborate on their own. And it adds something to the system. It makes the population on the campus a little more diverse. It's not just people from that country. But actually, it doesn't have huge impact. What it does is that it's a sprinkling of people doing things that they might be interested in. But if you want a strategic international partnerships, you actually have to ask broader questions. First, you have to say, what are actually your academic and research strengths? What are your strong programs that are high quality? And by high quality, you mean also not by your own judgment, by the judgment of your peers through various mechanisms. External examination of courses, external examination of theses at the PhD and master's level. And then also you have to say, what are your research strengths? What are the areas you want to be strong in? What are the areas you potentially could be strong in? And who do you have who can actually, as academics, who can marshal that? And what resources can the institution put behind those particular strengths? And if you like, our UP strategy is based exactly on those principles. And then what you then do is say, who are you actually going to partner proactively? Not people who come on their own, or people who bump into each other at conferences. We now actually, in a sense, target specific institutions, partly because they are complementary, it's their strengths. There's something you can learn, there's something they can learn from you. And then in that framework, then you actually craft real research programs and other programs. So in the example that includes me, the University of Oslo decided that it would partner with the University of Zimbabwe. There was a personal angle to how all of this happened. I don't have the time to tell you. And the person who's guilty is my supervisor. I think when he visited Zimbabwe, he met another Norwegian woman working there. He was then romantically interested. Then he had to justify why he would keep on going to Zimbabwe to his deal. And he decided to do a strategic partnership. No, but it's much more than that. There was a deliberate strategy by the University of Oslo to look for partners. But the strategy did not say Zimbabwe. So the romantic then led to the strategy. It became a very big collaboration because as a PhD student, I was also employed to manage part of the collaboration. It was in the multi-millions of dollars and cut across the university. But the common factor was the following: interested department or faculty in one institution and interest there, and then commonalities, interest, and people clicking. So what was in the collaboration was the following: that you develop new academic programs, you would upgrade or reform existing programs. Third, you would build capacity. In other words, if a program existed in Norway but didn't exist in Zimbabwe, you create it from the scratch. But you train people through the masters and PhD to come back home and then run those programs themselves, but in collaboration with the Norwegians. So out of that, for example, came 2 dictionaries in African languages. It was the linguistics department in Norway and another department in Stockholm, or Gothenburg, I forget, were in the business of building indigenous language dictionaries to actually make sure African languages survive. So you can see how this then went. Diversity of languages, diversity of culture, and also with people interacting from both sides. So then, there were joint research projects, there was capacity building, students being taught, there were programs being built, and then also there was a form of networking. I was particularly lucky, because my supervisor, as you can see, was both entrepreneurial romantically, but he was also entrepreneurial academically and in terms of research. So what he decided to do in the year I started my PhD was to have an international conference of the top people in the discipline. And for all of these people to come from across the world and present papers, and then would produce 2 books. He then mischievously decided that, although I had not even written my proposal, that I would respond to one of the papers as a fresh new PhD student who hadn't even written a sentence. And that by throwing me into the deep end, I would learn to swim and sink. And I'm absolutely, totally grateful for that. I was very young, I was a bit foolish, I thought I knew a lot of things. So I answered the big professor's paper. Some of it, when I look at it now, is nonsense. Some of it actually was very bright, actually, and became part of my proposal. But his idea henceforth was that all of his students would present in international conferences around the world. That's a form of internationalization, because you take a young student, you put them into the best of the around the world, and they learn to develop their career, not only in a national context, but in a broad international context. So I mean, I'll leave the example for now. But in that example, I can't count how many people were produced with masters and PhD, who then went back home and created programs. So my claim to fame at WITS is that I went there to create a program and a department that did not exist. But I learned that through an international collaboration. So I created a department back home, then I created a department, I created a new courses at Rhodes University, then I created a whole department at WITS University, and I assisted the University of Botswana to create a new department. But I declined employment there. So I think there are many valuable elements to an international collaboration. It's capacity building, international networking, and all of that. But also, what happened in that context is that the 2 collaborating universities become part of other existing networks. So for example, if you take what UP is doing, I was just trying to count sitting here, is that UP is part of 4 major networks, with universities on the continent, universities in Asia, universities in Europe, universities in the United States, and in the UK. That way, actually, the business of trying to improve your citations, your core authorships, and exchange of knowledge is happening at that particular kind of level. That's a very important element of internationalization. Because as you can see, my argument is that internationalization must be something that university believes in itself. Internationalization cannot be because if I internationalize, I will rise in the rankings. It's because it makes sense academically in the mission and vision of the university and in what it can deliver on the ground. So if you find, I said I'll drop the example, but here's one last thing. The programs that we created back home resulted in creating a new generation of academics, 1, 2, a new generation of professionals working in different communication fields, including health communication, democracy work, government communications, corporate communications, who did not exist, and then improve their capability. So you also, internationalization can lead into a transformation of another society, if you like. For the Norwegians, it expanded, because Norway is a largely homogeneous country. It's about 95% Norwegian. They don't take much immigration. But through their universities, they have the presence of other people that do not look like themselves. But also it gives them the confidence to be able to partner, to collaborate, and to travel across the world. So it's a very small country with huge global impact. It's partly, of course, backed by that. It's a very rich country in its own right. And so what are the lessons for this? I want to give a few more examples of what concretely UP is doing, which also includes what are the opportunities for the fourth industrial revolution in internationalization. How does one incorporate this in international strategies? I think that what ought to happen in this context of internationalization is that also when you do internationalization and people travel between the various universities and within the network, you learn to compare what teaching facilities exist. You learn to compare what research facilities. Sometimes you learn to share, you also share research facilities and teaching facilities. I mean, with the interconnected networks these days, people do teach courses across continents and countries. It's of course a nightmare sometimes to schedule them because of time differences. But I participated in enough many courses that are jointly taught between a university in Europe or in the US and a university in Africa, using technologies, whether all of the teaching technologies, live video, real time, and two people taking the same course. And people also moving actually physically is what I meant by mobilities and exchanges. So internationalization has many positive dimensions because actually you can then transform your curriculum and even decolonize your curriculum. Before I went to Oslo, my knowledge of, in my field is media studies, critical media studies, the theory, not the practice. I'm not exactly a journalist. I can write journalistically, but I'm not one. I study journalists and media houses. My image of the media system in the world and media policies and practice was the UK, the BBC, and Europe, and America, privately owned media. I didn't know there was other models in between. And in Scandinavia, there are models in between. Let me give you one throwaway example. In Norway and in Sweden, the government subsidizes private newspapers to maintain diversity of content and opinion. They are private newspapers, they are subsidized, but the government has no say into what content goes in there. And also the same is made for the public broadcaster and others. But just to give you the various meanings of how diversity can come in. So when I went back home to teach and to participate in policy debates, and policy debates I've participated in South Africa as well, I have the advantage of like trying to compare and saying what would be an appropriate model for South Africa. So if you search my CV, my very first book I edited is called Broadcasting Policy and Practice in Africa. And I did the book this way. I said, it's not useful to do a book on your own. Include government policymakers, other academics, and civil society. So the way we did the book was the following. We held a conference here in Joburg. We held a conference in Nairobi. We held for all of the countries in East, Central, and West, and the Horn of Africa. We held a conference in Morocco for Northern, then we held a conference in Ghana for West Africa. Then we chose the common themes, and I got a number of academics to contribute to the book. But beyond the book, we produced a manual for people who make policies and regulate media to ensure that they open up their media space. I can't claim the book led to that, but it's interesting that our media space on the continent is actually more open. So the reason I mention that is that the collaboration and the partnerships can have real impact in real society. And one learned that by actually being or studying and working in an international collaboration. Now I think that there's a number of things we should do in Africa. I mentioned this at the closed session of the presidents of universities. The one thing we need to do is that we have to strengthen intra-Africa collaborations through African networks. And then through those networks, we partner with other collaborators across the world, whether it's India, China, Southeast Asia, the United States, North America, South America, as well as Europe. Because that way you bring some critical mass. Because here is the danger, and this is what we must watch out in international collaborations. In the collaboration we had with the University of Oslo, it wasn't always all nice. We had huge arguments about some of the practices and the ethics. You see, in some collaborations, you find that if it's a northern partner, everybody is doing research about the society in the South. The people in the South are the ones who must be studied. But you don't study what is happening in the North. So we had a very vibrant debate about should we not also study Norway? Why do we think Norway is fine and beyond study? Shouldn't people from Africa learn about that and find out And so we grappled with those notions because there's always this idea that Africa is a place where you study others and not. There are ethical implications for that. It has echoes of colonialism. Remember the colonial anthropologists and the colonial discoverers who came to discover Africa as if there was no one who stayed there, instead of talking about people who lived there. So that's a problem. Also, those in the sciences know this. There's often inequity and lack of equality in joint collaborations and research. The principal investigator is the guy from the Northern University, and the junior researcher is the person from the Southern context. There must be co-equal principal investigators, because that is how you introduce ethics. Of course, there are inequalities in levels of knowledge, but there are other ways of dealing with that. So the ethics of who studies who. Now, how many minutes am I left?
2.
Only. No, but I have injury time. So, okay, in those 2 minutes, 30 seconds is how practically is UP, in a sense, integrating its international collaborations framework I've already told you. UP has decided actually to build particular facilities, platforms, if you like, infrastructure, if you like, that are primarily, of course, meant for itself, but of course that lend themselves and deliberately enable international collaboration. So the first is Future Africa. Future Africa is an institute and a campus, larger than Gibbs, our business school around the corner from here. So through Future Africa, we're going to do transdisciplinary research. So here are the principles. The people at the institute cannot only be South Africans. There must also be there must be Africans from the rest of the continent. You also bring in international collaborators. But further, you bring in business, civil society, and government. Because the idea of Future Africa is to co-create transdisciplinary knowledge. In other words, you break the silos between the different disciplines. And the research that you do is meant to solve the complex, seemingly intractable problems that face the African continent. And to do so with cutting-edge research that is globally comparable, can publish in the top journals, get your citations and so on. So you can see here that we're looking at impact at a very high level. But we actually built a physical campus, which is a conference center, it has a research commons, it has a dining room, it has gardens where we plant crops you can make salad on immediately, but do experiments in the lab as well. And also it has a 300-bed accommodation for single and married people. As we speak right now, there are 15 to 20 people from about 12, 13, 14 African countries who are undergoing a program in science leadership living there. They must learn the following: doing research, fundraising together, creating networks. When they leave that facility after 24 months, they know each other. The next time, they will collaborate for a big international research grant, and they have all of these skills. Finally, they must also learn how to communicate research to multiple publics, to policymakers, to ordinary members of the public, to other scientists, so they go to international conferences and all of that. We're also doing Engineering 4.0 Complex, which is a facility where we will test smart transportation for urbanization in Africa, test driverless or autonomous cars, and also test road surfaces for the best kind of tires we need. We also have I'm quite sure she's going to shut me down now. We also have a big data and data science center. And this big data and data science runs programs in collaboration with other South African universities. We now want to bring in African partners, international partners, and we're going to create a high-performance computing center, which is virtual but also includes all the disciplines that are into high computing, uses of artificial intelligence, which we teach in our curriculum as well as use in teaching in our university. So for example, we have an immersive reality lab where students doing mining can walk in a mine on campus, but it's all virtual reality. But when they eventually go into a mine, they actually know what mine conditions look like, and they are better able to comprehend things. And this, of course, is also done with our international collaborators. I'll stop there, then I can take some other stuff.
Thank you, Prof. We'll move over to Dr. Huerster.
I initially said, Carol, that I'll come last because the vice-chancellor from Pretoria University, my alma mater, by the way, would probably talk about his field and as a vice-chancellor, and not much about internationalization. So I was quite wrong. And for me not to repeat a lot of what was said, because I prepared to talk about internationalization, let me do two changes to what I've written. Firstly, what the VC just said is close to the ideal state of internationalization in an institution. What would the characteristics of an internationalized university be? A, the being of the institution should be outward looking and globally focused. On the campus should be a culture of a global culture. And in the University of Pretoria's case, I know they've got about 3,500, 4,000 international students, international faculty, etc. And thirdly, the curriculum should be internationalized, and then your research and your knowledge creation should also be. Now, the example that was cited from Pretoria University is elements of internationalization. I did a study about 6 months ago about the state of internationalization of higher education in South Africa. And I also did it with about 7 SADC institutions. And the problem is that the notion of comprehensive internationalization exists basically in the office of 1 or 2 people and doesn't materialize and exist throughout institutions. And when was the first session this morning, when Phil gave us the data on the rankings and also the criteria for rankings, I made the following note, that although the Times Higher and QS and the others, about 7.5%, 8% of the ranking of institutions refer to international students and staff on campuses and 1 or 2 other, the partnerships and so on. If you now look at the other criteria, and this comes back to comprehensive internationalization. If you look at the other criteria, the citations and what you focus on is how many, the quality of the citation, but also those that are jointly cited, international and local. That you will not be able to do if you're not internationalized. The other criteria, which is the one on the survey that's done, of course, the survey isn't focused just on a particular nationality. So if your university is not known outside your borders, you won't get the feedback from your peers. So interestingly, internationalization in the rankings lives comprehensively throughout all of it. So unless an institution does that, and I know most of us say we shouldn't play the rankings for the sake of playing the rankings, but use it as a benchmarking tool. I do believe that the rankings as they have been structured would allow institutions to measure their state of internationalization, their comprehensive state of internationalization. And it's important, because if we now ask the next question, what should the university's internationalization strategies look like given the 4th industrial revolution? And I think we could all be privileged to the previous speaker. Because when we talk about 4th industrial revolution, everybody thinks science and technology. And I firmly support him that it is all about humans. And therefore, when we ask ourselves what should be the curriculum and the outcomes of our teaching for students to be globally competent citizens that will work in the fourth industrial revolution, then I believe the elements in our curricula should focus clearly on how internationally and interculturally competent are they, aware of their own cultural heritage, proud ambassadors of Africa, because they're going to work globally, whether they leave Joburg or not, and competent to communicate the strengths of the continent of Africa, able to contribute African thought to the global world, able to understand knowledge from a variety of paradigms, and able to evaluate, transfer, and transform external knowledge paradigms to advance the African development agenda, or if you want to call it the SDGs. I do believe that higher education internationalization globally need to rethink its business. Those of you that's been in the field know that there's two parts of internationalization. The one that you just explained, which lives in the academic environment of universities. The other is the business, which is a money-making and a commercial venture. I don't believe the commercial venture is internationalization. It's the commercialization of higher education, but we sweet-coated it with the internationalization brush to give it the status. I do think we as higher education practitioners need to break that practice and be clear about what do we mean by internationalization and what is the commercialization of higher education. I am not making a value judgment about any of the two. I do believe they should exist. But the reason why I'm saying this is the fractured world that we are now seeing. How is it that the US, and let me use the US, and we can for that matter Brexit and the UK, who have had the exposure of more international students than any other space in the world. That means globally people came in and left. How is it they became so nationalist and locally focused? Isn't it because they never used the international students that came into their spaces to really liberate their minds and do all the things that you've said? I don't think it happened. It's because the focus is bring in, they pay our fees, and when they graduate, they go back. We know that the US and California, for that matter, the whole Silicon Valley and the development of that is built on the brains of international students who were kept for a while and then sent out. We shouldn't make the same mistake. I did an analysis which will be published in Study South Africa soon on the last 15 years of international mobility into and out of South Africa. South Africa has actually become, and we're not a real international hub, we're a Southern African hub. 72% of all our international students are from Southern Africa. But the beauty of this is, in the time, the last 15 years, we've graduated closely, approximately 6,000 PhDs from SADC in South Africa. And I know that the majority of them have gone back. I think what we as South African higher education must do, and when Times Higher start looking at impact, I think we need to start looking at what's the impact when students come and study and go back, and the PhDs are the one good example. What was the impact of the students who studied in South Africa and went back to Zimbabwe, to Zambia, to Namibia, to Botswana. At one stage, we had nearly 8,000 Botswana students in South Africa. If all these elements that I mentioned was built into the curriculum, why is the collaboration, academic and otherwise, still so fractured? Should we not rethink the way that we practice internationalization in South Africa and in the rest of Africa? The World Bank is funding about 23 centers of excellence in Southern and East Africa, more East than Southern Africa. Those of you that's been engaged with them would know there's quite a bit of funding, and it's amazing spaces. I worked until end of last year with Nelson Mandela University. There's another Nelson Mandela University, the one in Arusha, the Nelson Mandela Institute of Science and Technology, that was actually created by Madiba. They graduating they only have masters and PhD students in science and technology. And in the last 4 or 5 years, that's why your data shows that times higher, that there's a lot of PhD coming out of Africa now. These centers have been created to produce new knowledge in science and technology. But guess what? They're not connected. They haven't established the network that you talk about. And I think that we need to rethink how we do business with each other in Africa before we start looking at others. Because there's so much capacity within ourselves. I'm talking about global capacity. If we just are brave enough to create those networks within Africa. We should actually move away from thinking that, and I don't blame the ranking for that, but sometimes the ranking and competition amongst institutions go hand in hand. I think we must understand that we can compete but also collaborate. And internationalization, in my mind, is that common element in higher education's existence that would make collaboration a natural product. I don't believe we should stop striving to be more international while we are working within Africa. And interestingly, the decolonisation debate, and that's actually a debate on its own, but I believe decolonisation have the whole notion and the activism that was on campuses have created a burning platform, and it's creating the space for us to rethink the way that we're doing and practicing internationalization too. And decolonisation, internationalization, and Africanization are actually not in conflict with each other. One should see it as one element where we could actually transform our higher education institutions to be ready for for what's lying ahead as far as the fourth industrial revolution is concerned. So just to conclude, I do believe universities need to perhaps engage a little bit more with the theory and of comprehensive internationalization. What does it mean? A, and B is create at different levels understanding of the management of internationalization. It lives sometimes up in the senior management and in the international office, and between that it's practiced in a fractured way elsewhere. I do believe comprehensive internationalization demands from higher education institutions that as much as we transfer skills to heads of departments to manage a department and the discipline, we should actually create the capacity within those departments to also, how do you manage comprehensive internationalization?
Yeah. Thank you. Just a question, and I can direct it to both of you. I mean, we all see the fourth industrial revolution as an opportunity to level the playing fields and for Africa to be a player, an active player. And it was quite clear that the information exists, the technologies exist, everybody has access. And I think the argument was made with the earlier speaker, with the keynote speaker, that, you don't need universities because that, information is available. Is there opportunity, based on our rich history, culture, also the fact that we in Africa have a high proportion of young people that are upcoming and the future leaders, and also talking about, the attributes and the skills and the soft skills. Creativity is now one of the top skills that they predict, or abilities that you need to have for the future, whereas in the past it was, for the few. And, it's changing all the time. But so how do we best approach, rather than emulate, what internationalization tends to do, in terms of having this more homogeneous, eventually an homogeneous approach?
I don't like to sound like the CEO of Kodak before the company went down. But I think that, and also one doesn't know what technologies will develop in the future. But I think that the previous speaker was also being fairly futuristic. Not everyone is Kodak. So, and here I'll take my example from an article published by your magazine, the one that you have copies here. A month or so ago, you published an article about how people who enroll on online courses or programs actually fail. I still remember this, it stuck in my mind. Only 3% of people who register in those programs actually graduate or complete their programs. And when its research was done, it found out that they lacked something. They lacked a degree of their human contact that goes with contact teaching, which doesn't mean that online is useless. So at UP, for example, we practice, if you drive into our gates today, you'll see something that is very strange. Normally at boom gates or gates of institutions these days, is enter at your own risk. If you lose your car, it's not our problem. But our boom gates are written, adopt hybrid learning, adopt hybrid teaching. And this is what this means, or blended, and we also call it blended learning. It's a very intelligent combination of the online, the virtual, as well as the contact. That's why we have an immersive reality lab, where a student can walk into a digital facility and find their way in a mine. But also then they will have a lecturer who will teach them about mine operations, how mines work, and so on. So I think the future is actually an integration of the physical and the virtual in very interesting ways that are still developing. So I want to bet with the previous speaker, universities are not Kodak. They will be here in the future, but they will only be here in the future if they know how to intelligently adopt and adapt the emerging technologies to their core business of not just imparting knowledge, because that is the problem with people who go online. They want to draw out information and imbibe it and walk away. Education actually is the business of interacting with knowledge, and in the process, creating knowledge for yourself and learning how to learn, because learning is lifelong. And I think that's why the first industrial revolution, where I agreed with him, is that it's look at what human beings will do with the technology, not just what the technology can do. Because technologies are deployed by human beings and so forth. So I think that's important. So you're quite right that the reason why universities like mine are moving into using AI in teaching and learning, teaching about AI, using all of these technologies, is because the generations who come into our universities, the undergraduates largely, are very easy adopters of all of these technologies. In many cases, it's all the technology they really were born to is the new technologies. So just like we were born into some technologies, they are born into, so that's why we call them digital natives. A digital native is one who believes this has always been like this, without knowing that it was never like that, and it's also going to change. Let me end with a famous story around this. A man my age, perhaps, went home one day and said to his son, I finally replied to your email. And his little son looked at him and said, what's email?
Thanks. Around homogenization
Yes,
and where we need to
just-
keep our own
I'm-
identity?
I'm just looking at an article that was a survey that was done by Times and Microsoft on the survey on artificial intelligence. And it's a very interesting article. But in the end, the conclusion was that the mortar and brick institutions as they exist today won't stop. They will just have to change the way that they teach and how they teach and what they offer. Because the majority of the respondents, which was a wide group of people that they surveyed, are clear that the human interaction is what is required. Some of it might be virtual, but there is a clear indication that we as humans want to still be human. So there was a book written about 20 years ago, Dancing with the Devil. That was when online and distance education was and it was predicted that universities were going to disappear. And of course, they never did. As an historian, I can tell you now, you can go back in history, whenever there was a major change in societal existence, universities were the first, universities and churches were the first that were said, oh, you're going to change or you're going to disappear. And I don't believe, if we look at the university of 1650 and the university of today, they're totally different. And it might be that some universities will disappear because they did not adapt to the challenges, but I don't believe they will disappear because, well, there might be new ways that universities exist. And just to what he said about AI and students, one thing that we as universities must look at carefully is the way that we structure ourselves to protect ourselves from ourselves. And you know, universities will tomorrow stop to exist if we do not issue a degree, that qualification. There's a demand from students to actually get knowledge from other places. We as universities are over-regulated and say, well, if you don't do what I teach, I'm not going to give you credit for this, and therefore, now, unless we change that, because in this, the fourth industrial revolution, the nano qualifications and these nano bits of knowledge that are lying around and that actually contribute to the students' holistic education, I think we need to make sure that we include that in, and we are adaptive enough to have evaluate that and say, yes, I will accept program X, Y, and Z that you've done with Audacity, you can bring it in. If we don't do that, there might be in future a space that would be recognized by industry where students can collect credits from all over the world and take it to a place who will give the accreditation. If we don't adapt to that, that's when we might lose stop existing as universities.
Okay, thanks. I think one of the challenges is almost that foresight approach and constantly, which is something that universities are having to introduce and really actively pursue a lot more. So I think now we'll open the floor to contributions from other institutions or key areas where people can indicate that, as higher education institutions, we're still missing the boat and not addressing, and we will be monuments in some areas. Yes. There's Mike.
My name is Untitled Chapter. I'm from Pearson Institute of Higher Education. I just wanted to ask a question which is bothering me. How do we convince the citizen or the taxpayer in our country to support internationalization. The taxpayer who doesn't know about all of these benefits, how do we convince the taxpayer that their money is well spent when we bring in international students and faculty into our space?
Thanks. If there isn't another question, we can start to respond. I'll start with you, Nico.
It's not in the public debate yet. Look, we've got about face-to-face, and UNISA have about 29,000 distance education international students. The majority are not in South Africa. In South Africa, we've got about 48,000 international students. They're fully subsidized, and it is a sizable subsidy. I can show you the publication. Those students that are, and that's the answer that I would give to the citizenry. The taxes that those students generate through VAT and other ways that they are taxed in South Africa, actually, we still have a surplus of about 15% of the subsidy that those students receive. So the taxpayer aren't actually paying anything for the international students that are here, because what they bring in and what they spend in the country covers the taxpayers' money. But I don't want us to take that argument. I think the benefit is much more than that, the financial benefit. The real benefits of international students being on our campus, creating, developing our own students to be global citizens, and then, let me now use Nelson Mandela University as an example. We've established two chapters of our alumni, one in Nairobi and one in Uganda. The benefits that we get from those alumni are, you can't even calculate that in money. So remember what I said, that 70% of our international students are from SADC countries, and therefore it is not for us to say yes we want or we don't want. Our government signed an agreement with all the other SADC countries, which is called the SADC Protocol. We are not even at 5%, where we said we will have 5% of our places for SADC students. But the benefit that we get as a country by the knowledge mobility and the skills mobility that we've created, I think it outweighs the subsidy that those students receive by far.
Thanks.
Okay, I think he's covered some of it. It can't be a wholly financial argument, because the financial argument perhaps is the easier one. Remember that universities have a two-tier system of tuition fees, local fees and international fees. In fact, as you alluded to, some universities adopt a perverse model of internationalization. You can make money out of having international students because they pay more fees than local students. But that will be perverse because you displace local students, and that is not what you want to do. The non-financial debate, but which also has financial and commercial and economic growth implications, is, in a country like this and several African countries, much more difficult to make agree, but can be made, and this is the argument. I, in the position I am, and because of what the University of Pretoria is, we interact a lot with the top CEOs of our companies. One of the things they keep saying to me is that, especially those companies that have continent-wide operations, they want us to admit more international students, because it also helps them demonstrate in those countries when they seek mining licenses, banking licenses, insurance licenses, business licenses, that they are also making a contribution to that country's skills. And I think that so the conversation might be difficult with the ordinary Jack and Jill who says, I'm paying my taxes. But for those people who are discerning and understand that African integration brings economic benefits to their own country and enables business, the argument is, in fact, they are critical of me saying, you do not have enough students. from country X. But when I check what they are doing, I find that in that country they've been asked in a licensing process, what other value do you want to do? You want to extract value, but you have no value. But they also say to me that it's better for them to employ people who are educated in South African universities, but who are from that country. And because they understand the culture here, the business here, but they are locals, and also they will earn their money and they will better run those companies. So there are mutualities here that I think universities should communicate better to the ordinary taxpaying citizen.